What if the story of Europe wasn't written in stone, but in our DNA? The Balkan Peninsula holds a unique genetic key, a living record of Ice Age survivors, ancient farmers, migrating tribes, and vast empires. This series unravels why this rugged land became a crucible of human history, preserving a genetic tapestry unlike any other. Join us to decode the secrets hidden within the very cells of the Balkan peoples. The story of the Balkan Peninsula's unique genetic makeup begins not with civilizations or migrations, but in the deep, frigid past of the Pleistocene epoch. During the last glacial maximum, a period of intense cold that peaked around 20,000 years ago, vast ice sheets smothered the northern half of Europe, rendering it a desolate and uninhabitable wasteland. This dramatic climatic event acted as a powerful evolutionary bottleneck, forcing flora, fauna, and the small, scattered bands of anatomically modern humans to retreat southwards into a few precious pockets of survivable land known as glacial refugia. While Iberia and the Franco-Cantabrian region are well-known sanctuaries, the Balkan Peninsula arguably served as the most critical and enduring of these European havens. Its extraordinary topography, a complex and formidable mosaic of towering mountain ranges like the Dinaric Alps and the Balkan Mountains, interwoven with deep, sheltered river valleys, extensive cave systems, and a long, fractured coastline, created a multitude of microclimates. This geographic diversity meant that even as glaciers advanced elsewhere, pockets of temperate woodland and grassland could persist, providing the necessary resources for hunter-gatherer populations to survive and even thrive in relative isolation. It was within this rugged sanctuary that a foundational element of the European gene pool was preserved and nurtured. This is the story of Y-DNA haplogroup I, the only major paternal lineage considered to be of native European origin, a direct genetic echo of the continent's first human inhabitants. While other lineages trace their origins to the Near East or Central Asia, haplogroup I is the legacy of the Cro-Magnons. Within the Balkan refugium, a specific branch of this lineage, known as I2A, became particularly prominent. For millennia, these Paleolithic Balkan populations lived in small, mobile groups, their movements dictated by the seasonal availability of game and edible plants. This lifestyle, combined with the isolating nature of the mountainous terrain, fostered significant genetic drift. Different valleys or coastal regions might host populations that, over thousands of years, developed subtly distinct genetic profiles, even while sharing a common ancestral root. This period of isolation was crucial. It allowed the I2A lineage to not only survive but to diversify and become deeply embedded in the region, forming a resilient genetic bedrock that would underlie all subsequent demographic events. When the climate began to warm around 12,000 years ago, initiating the Mesolithic period, these Balkan populations began to expand. They moved out from their glacial shelters, repopulating not only the peninsula itself but also venturing northwards and eastwards into the newly thawed territories of Central and Eastern Europe. This post-glacial expansion from the Balkan sanctuary is a pivotal event in European prehistory, carrying the I2A signature deep into the continent. It explains the significant presence of this haplogroup in areas far from the Balkans today, such as Sardinia and parts of Eastern Europe. However, its highest frequency and greatest diversity remain in the Western Balkans, particularly among populations in Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia, a clear testament to where its ancestral homeland lies. This deep Paleolithic continuity is the first and most fundamental reason for the region's genetic uniqueness. Unlike Western Europe, which saw a more comprehensive population replacement with the arrival of farmers, the Balkans retained a far stronger connection to its ancient hunter-gatherer past, creating a genetic canvas upon which all future layers of history would be painted. The warming climate that marked the end of the Ice Age did not just trigger the expansion of Europe's indigenous hunter-gatherers. It also set the stage for a revolutionary transformation that would forever alter the continent's demographic landscape. Around 9,000 years ago, a new way of life, agriculture, began to spread from its cradle in the Fertile Crescent of the Near East. This Neolithic revolution was not merely an exchange of ideas. It was propelled by a wave of human migration, as farming populations expanded in search of new lands to cultivate. For these Anatolian and Near Eastern farmers, the Balkan Peninsula was the primary gateway into Europe. Crossing the narrow straits of the Bosphorus and the Aegean Sea, they arrived on the shores of Greece and Thrace, bringing with them domesticated plants like wheat and barley, animals such as sheep and goats, and a completely new genetic signature. These newcomers were genetically distinct from the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers they encountered. Their paternal lineages were dominated by haplogroups such as G2A, E1b1b, and J2, all of which have their roots in the Near East and Anatolia. Their arrival in the Balkans initiated one of the most important chapters in European genetic history: the interaction between the continent's first inhabitants and these incoming agriculturalists. The process was not a simple replacement. Instead, the Balkans became a dynamic zone of admixture and cultural exchange. The farmers advanced primarily through the major river valleys, such as the Vardar, Struma, and Morava, which provided fertile soil and natural corridors leading into the heart of the continent. In these lowland areas, the dense, settled farming communities, supported by a stable food supply, experienced a population boom that quickly overwhelmed the sparse, mobile hunter-gatherer groups. Archaeological evidence from early farming cultures like the Starcevo-Koros-Kris complex shows the rapid establishment of villages and a new material culture. Genetically, this resulted in a significant shift in the local gene pool, with the new Anatolian lineages becoming dominant. However, the story was different in the rugged, mountainous interior. The Dinaric Alps and other highland regions were less suitable for early agriculture and remained strongholds for the indigenous populations, who carried the Paleolithic I2A lineage. Here, the process of integration was much slower and more complex. These hunter-gatherer groups likely adopted aspects of the Neolithic lifestyle gradually, through trade and limited intermarriage with their new neighbors, without being completely absorbed. This created a lasting genetic gradient across the peninsula, a pattern that is still visible today. Populations in the fertile plains of the eastern and southern Balkans tend to show a higher proportion of Neolithic farmer ancestry, while those in the mountainous west retain a stronger signal of the indigenous Paleolithic heritage. This dynamic makes the Balkans a crucial region for understanding the Neolithic transition. It was not a uniform wave of replacement, but a mosaic of interactions that varied significantly with geography. The peninsula acted as both a conduit and a filter. It was the main route through which the Neolithic expansion spread to the rest of Europe, but its own complex topography ensured that the process was one of admixture rather than conquest, preserving a significant portion of the older genetic layer. This fusion of two ancient and distinct peoples, the indigenous European hunter-gatherers and the incoming Near Eastern farmers, created a novel and complex genetic foundation, setting the stage for the next waves of migration that would further shape the region's destiny. Following the establishment of farming communities, the Balkan Peninsula entered a period of relative stability during the late Neolithic, characterized by the growth of sophisticated cultures like the Vinca civilization. However, this equilibrium was destined to be disrupted by a new and powerful migratory force emanating from the vast grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas. Beginning around 5,000 years ago, during the transition from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, a semi-nomadic people known as the Proto-Indo-Europeans began a massive expansion from their homeland on the Pontic-Caspian steppe. These were pastoralists and warriors, whose culture was defined by horse domestication, wheeled vehicles, and a patriarchal social structure, often marked archaeologically by their distinctive burial mounds, or kogons. Their arrival in the Balkans represented a third major genetic and cultural layering upon the existing Paleolithic-Neolithic fusion. The genetic signature of these steppe migrants is primarily associated with Y-DNA haplogroups R1a and, to a lesser extent, R1b. As they moved westwards into Europe, they followed several routes, with the Danube River Valley serving as a primary corridor into the Balkans. Their impact was profound and multifaceted. Linguistically, they introduced the Indo-European languages that would eventually supplant the pre-existing, non-Indo-European tongues spoken by the Neolithic farmers and remnant hunter-gatherers. Over time, these new dialects evolved into the Paleo-Balkan languages of antiquity, such as Illyrian, Thracian, and Dacian, the ancestors of many of the region's modern languages. Genetically, the arrival of the steppe peoples was not a complete population replacement, but rather a process of elite dominance and admixture. The newcomers, with their mobile equestrian lifestyle and advanced bronze weaponry, likely established themselves as a new ruling class over the settled agricultural populations. This resulted in a significant injection of R1a and R1b lineages into the Balkan gene pool. The distribution of this steppe ancestry today is not uniform. It tends to be more concentrated in the northern and eastern parts of the peninsula, reflecting the main axes of migration down the Danube and across the plains of modern-day Romania and Bulgaria. In contrast, the mountainous regions of the Western Balkans, which were more difficult to penetrate and control, show a lower frequency of these R haplogroups, allowing the older I2A and E1b1b lineages to remain more prominent. This migration fundamentally reshaped Balkan society. It introduced a more hierarchical and martial ethos, which contrasted with the seemingly more egalitarian and settled societies of the Neolithic era. The fusion of the incoming steppe pastoralists with the established farming communities created the cultural and genetic bedrock for the great Bronze Age civilizations and the powerful tribal confederations of the Iron Age. This tripartite genetic ancestry, indigenous Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, Anatolian Neolithic farmer, and Pontic steppe pastoralist, became the classic formula for the European gene pool. However, the uniqueness of the Balkans lies in the specific proportions of this blend. The strong survival of the pre-Neolithic I2A lineage, combined with the peninsula's role as the primary entry point for farmers and a major corridor for steppe peoples, created a genetic profile distinct from other parts of Europe, where one of these three ancestral components often became more dominant. The Indo-European migrations did not erase the past. They added a crucial and transformative layer that forged the identity of the peoples who would be known to the ancient Greeks and Romans. As the fusion of indigenous, farmer, and steppe peoples solidified across the Balkans during the early Bronze Age, a new center of power and cultural innovation began to emerge in the peninsula's southernmost reaches. On the Greek mainland, The Mycenaean civilization rose to prominence around 1600 BC, building upon influences from the earlier Minoan civilization of Crete. Characterized by their formidable citadel palaces at sites like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, a sophisticated bureaucracy, and extensive maritime trade networks, the Mycenaeans represented the first great state-level society in Europe. Their influence, however, was not confined to southern Greece. It radiated northwards, casting a long cultural and genetic shadow over the central and southern Balkans. This was not a period of mass migration or conquest into the Balkan hinterland, but rather one of intense interaction driven by trade and the projection of elite power. The Mycenaeans were hungry for resources, particularly the metals, copper, tin, and gold, that were abundant in the Balkan mountains. To secure these resources, they established trade routes that penetrated deep into the interior, following river valleys and ancient pathways. Along these routes, they established outposts and forged alliances with local Balkan chieftains. This created a Mycenaean koine, a shared cultural sphere where Mycenaean goods, weaponry, pottery styles, and social practices were adopted and adapted by local populations. This process of cultural exchange inevitably led to genetic exchange. The genetic profile of the Mycenaeans themselves was a complex blend, reflecting their position at the crossroads of the Aegean. They carried a mix of Anatolian Neolithic farmer ancestry, similar to that found throughout the Balkans, but also a distinct contribution from Caucasian and Iranian-related populations, likely arriving via Anatolia, alongside the Indo-European steppe ancestry that linked them to the broader European context. As Mycenaean traders, warriors, and artisans moved into the southern Balkans, and as local Balkan peoples were drawn into the Mycenaean economic orbit, a subtle but significant gene flow occurred. This process introduced or reinforced the presence of specific subclades of Y-DNA haplogroups J2 and E1b1b, which were particularly common in the Aegean world. This genetic imprint is most visible in the southern parts of the peninsula, in regions like modern-day Albania, North Macedonia, and southern Bulgaria, which formed the immediate periphery of the Mycenaean heartland. The influence of Mycenae helped to solidify a genetic and cultural gradient within the Balkans, distinguishing the more cosmopolitan, Aegean-oriented south from the more continentally focused north. The collapse of the Mycenaean civilization around 1100 BC, during the wider Late Bronze Age collapse, had further demographic consequences. The disintegration of centralized palace economies led to widespread disruption, population movements, and the fragmentation of societies. This period of turmoil, often referred to as the Greek Dark Ages, may have triggered migrations within the Balkans, as displaced groups sought new homes, leading to further genetic mixing and the blurring of old boundaries. The legacy of the Mycenaean era was therefore twofold. It introduced a specific Aegean genetic layer into the southern Balkan populations, and its eventual collapse created a period of demographic flux that contributed to the complex tapestry of the subsequent Iron Age. In the wake of the Bronze Age collapse, the centralized power structures of the Mycenaean world vanished, giving way to a more fragmented and localized landscape. It was during this transitional period, the early Iron Age, that distinct tribal confederations began to consolidate across the Balkan Peninsula, their identities forged from the deep-rooted genetic and cultural substrate of the preceding millennia. In the western half of the peninsula, from the foothills of the Alps down to northern Greece, a powerful and widespread group of peoples emerged, known collectively to the Greeks and later the Romans as the Illyrians. They were not a monolithic nation but a multitude of tribes, such as the Rdei, Tolantii, and Dardanii, who shared a common material culture and likely spoke related dialects of an Indo-European language. The genetic profile of the Illyrians represents a direct continuation and crystallization of the unique Balkan ancestral blend. Their foundation was the ancient Paleolithic stock, reflected in the remarkably high frequency of Y-DNA haplogroup I2A, which had persisted in this region since the last ice age. Layered upon this was the significant contribution of the Neolithic farmers, E1b, 1b, and G2a, and the Indo-European steppe peoples, R1b. The specific combination of these lineages, particularly the co-dominance of I2a and R1b in many Illyrian inhabited areas, became the characteristic genetic signature of the Western Balkans. A key factor in the forging of this distinct Illyrian genetic identity was the geography they inhabited. The rugged mountainous terrain of the Dinaric Alps acted as both a fortress and a crucible. It was difficult for outside groups to penetrate and conquer, which insulated the Illyrian tribes from large-scale population replacements. At the same time, the landscape encouraged a degree of tribal endogamy and isolation, allowing specific genetic markers to become concentrated in certain regions through the process of genetic drift. This explains why, even today, the highest frequencies of haplogroup I2A in the world are found in the heart of the former Illyrian territory. Their interactions with neighboring peoples also shaped their genetic periphery. To the north, they bordered Celtic tribes who had expanded into the Danube basin, leading to localized admixture. To the east, they met the Thracians, another major Paleo-Balkan group with a similar, yet distinct, genetic makeup. To the south, their long coastline along the Adriatic Sea brought them into contact with Greek colonists and Italic sea traders, facilitating a limited but steady gene flow across the water. This maritime activity was a crucial part of Illyrian life, with some tribes, like the Liburnians, becoming renowned seafarers and pirates. This coastal interaction introduced a slightly more diverse, pan-Mediterranean element to their gene pool compared to the tribes of the deep interior. The Illyrians, therefore, represent the solidification of a uniquely Western Balkan genetic identity. The relative stability of the Iron Age, without the massive, transformative migrations of the Neolithic or Bronze Age, allowed this specific blend of ancient ancestral components to coalesce and become the dominant demographic reality of the region. This Illyrian genetic substrate proved to be incredibly resilient, surviving subsequent centuries of Roman, Slavic, and Ottoman rule, and it is now widely considered to be the foundational component for many modern Western Balkan populations, including Albanians, Bosnians, Montenegrins, and Croatians, providing a direct genetic link to the pre-Roman peoples of the Iron Age. While the Illyrians and Thracians consolidated their tribal identities in the interior, the Balkan coastline became a stage for the ambitions of the great Mediterranean civilizations. Beginning in the 8th century BC, a wave of Greek colonization established a string of city-states, polis, along the Adriatic, Ionian, and Black Sea shores. Cities like Dyrrhachium, modern Durrës, Apollonia, and Histria became vibrant centers of Hellenic culture, trade, and influence, planted amidst native Illyrian and Thracian populations. This colonization was not a military conquest of the hinterland, but the establishment of urban enclaves. However, these cities acted as powerful magnets, drawing local peoples into their economic and cultural orbits. The result was a slow but steady process of admixture. Greek colonists, carrying paternal lineages like E1b, 1b, and J2 that were common in the Aegean, intermarried with the local Balkan populace. This created a localized genetic effect, enriching the coastal gene pool with a distinctly Hellenic layer and strengthening its connection to the wider Mediterranean world. The subsequent arrival of Rome, however, would have a far more profound and peninsula-wide impact. The Roman conquest of the Balkans, a piecemeal process that spanned several centuries and was completed by the early 1st century AD, integrated the entire region into a single vast empire for the first time. Roman rule was transformative, but its genetic impact was complex and uneven. The Romans were master engineers and administrators, and they overlaid the Balkan landscape with a network of paved roads, most famously the Via Egnatia, which connected the Adriatic coast to Byzantium. They established military camps, administrative centers, and retirement colonies for legionaries, coloniae. These new urban centers and military garrisons became cosmopolitan melting pots. The Roman army was not solely comprised of men from the Italian peninsula. It was a multi-ethnic force with soldiers recruited from every corner of the empire: Gaul, Spain, North Africa, Syria, and Anatolia. When these soldiers retired, they were often granted land in the Balkans, where they settled and started families. Similarly, Roman administrators, merchants, artisans, and slaves brought a diverse array of genetic ancestries to the region's cities. This introduced a new, highly varied layer of DNA into the Balkan gene pool, subtly increasing the presence of lineages from across the Mediterranean and Near East. However, the impact of this Roman-era gene flow was largely concentrated in the urban centers and along the major transportation arteries. In the remote, mountainous hinterlands, the life of the rural Illyrian and Thracian tribespeople changed far less. They might have adopted Latin or Roman customs, but their genetic makeup remained largely insulated from this new cosmopolitan influx. Therefore, Romanization was primarily a cultural and linguistic process rather than a major demographic replacement. The most significant genetic legacy of this period was perhaps the ethnogenesis of the Vlach, or Aromanian, people. These Romance-speaking pastoralists, found throughout the central and southern Balkans, are believed to be the descendants of the Romanized native populations, Illyrians, Thracians, and Dacians. Their genetic profile reflects this history perfectly, a foundational Paleo-Balkan substrate upon which a clear Italic/Roman genetic layer was added. The Roman era, therefore, did not erase the existing genetic landscape but made it more complex, creating a starker genetic divide between the cosmopolitan, well-connected lowlands and the more isolated, traditionalist highlands, a pattern that would persist for centuries. The formidable power of the Roman Empire, which had unified the Balkans for half a millennium, began to wane in the 4th and 5th centuries AD. The empire's northern frontier along the Danube River, once a heavily fortified boundary, became increasingly porous, culminating in its effective collapse in the 6th century. This opened the floodgates for one of the most significant demographic transformations in the history of the peninsula: the arrival and settlement of vast numbers of Slavic-speaking tribes. Originating from a homeland thought to be in the Pripet Marshes region of modern-day Ukraine and Belarus, these Slavic groups moved southwards, drawn by the vacuum of power and the relative wealth of the Byzantine provinces. Their migration was not a single organized invasion but a massive, century-long process of infiltration and settlement that fundamentally reshaped the ethnic and genetic map of the Balkans. The Slavs brought with them a distinct genetic profile, characterized primarily by Y-DNA haplogroup R1a, specifically the R1a M458 and R1a Z280 subclades, and crucially, a specific branch of the ancient European haplogroup I2a, I2, L621, also known as I2CTS10228. While I2a is of Paleolithic Balkan origin, this particular subclade appears to have migrated north into Eastern Europe after the last ice age and later experienced a massive population explosion during the Slavic ethnogenesis, becoming a co-marker of the Slavic expansion alongside R1a. As the Slavs poured into the Balkans, they settled the fertile plains and river valleys from the Eastern Alps down to the Peloponnese in Greece. Their interaction with the pre-existing populations, the descendants of the Romanized Illyrians, Thracians, and Greeks, was varied and complex. In many lowland regions, the sheer number of Slavic settlers led to the demographic overwhelming and assimilation of the native inhabitants. The pre-Slavic languages, except for Greek and the ancestor of Albanian, largely disappeared, replaced by Slavic dialects, and the genetic landscape was permanently altered by the massive influx of R1a and I2, L621 lineages. However, the process was far from a complete replacement. The mountainous regions and the Adriatic coast once again acted as refugia for the pre-Slavic populations. In the rugged highlands of modern Albania, Montenegro, and western Greece, the indigenous peoples were able to resist assimilation to a much greater degree, preserving their languages and their distinct genetic heritage, which was characterized by a higher proportion of older lineages like E1b1b, R1b, and the non-Slavic branches of I2a. This created a new and enduring genetic fault line across the peninsula. The Central and Eastern Balkans became predominantly Slavic-speaking, but their gene pool was not purely Slavic. It was a new synthesis, a blend of the Slavic newcomers with the substantial Romanized Paleo-Balkan population they had absorbed. This is the key to understanding the genetics of modern South Slavs, Serbs, Croats, Bulgarians, etc. They are distinguished from their West and East Slavic cousins by their significantly higher frequencies of native Balkan haplogroups like the older forms of I2a, E1b1b, and J2, which they inherited from the populations that were present before the 6th century. The Great Slavic migrations, therefore, did not wipe the slate clean. Instead, they introduced a powerful new demographic element that mixed in varying proportions with the deeply rooted and complex genetic strata already present, creating the fundamental genetic and linguistic divisions that define the Balkans to this day. Even as the Slavic migrations irrevocably altered the demographic map of the Balkans, the region did not fall into a political vacuum. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered on the magnificent capital of Constantinople and known to history as the Byzantine Empire, continued to exert powerful influence over the peninsula for nearly 1,000 years. While it lost control over vast swathes of the interior to the Slavs and other groups, Byzantium never fully relinquished its claim to the Balkans, and its policies, military activities, and cultural prestige continued to shape the region's gene pool in subtle but important ways. The empire was a multi-ethnic and cosmopolitan entity, and its armies were a reflection of this diversity. Rather than relying solely on local levies, the Byzantines recruited soldiers from across their vast territory and beyond. Armenians, Georgians, and other peoples from the Caucasus, known for their martial prowess, were a staple of the imperial forces. Anatolians from the empire's heartland, Syrians, and even Norsemen, who served in the elite Varangian Guard, were stationed in Balkan garrisons and fought in Balkan campaigns. When these soldiers completed their service, they often settled in the region, marrying local women and contributing their diverse genetic lineages to the local population. This process introduced a steady, low-level trickle of DNA from the Caucasus, Anatolia, and the Near East into the Balkan gene pool, particularly in areas with a strong imperial military presence, such as Thrace and Macedonia. Beyond military recruitment, the emperors frequently employed a policy of mass population transfer, known as metanastasis, for strategic purposes. To break up rebellious Slavic tribal unions, the Byzantines would forcibly deport entire communities from the Balkans to Anatolia. Conversely, to repopulate and secure strategically important but depopulated regions in the Balkans, they would settle loyal populations from Anatolia and Armenia, such as the Paulician and Armenian communities moved to Thrace in the 8th and 10th centuries. These state-sponsored relocations, though sporadic, were sometimes on a massive scale and acted as a direct conduit for gene flow between Asia Minor and the Balkans. Constantinople itself was a demographic vortex. As one of the world's largest and wealthiest cities, it drew merchants, artisans, scholars, and refugees from Europe, Asia, and Africa. Its influence radiated into the surrounding Balkan provinces, and movement between the capital and the hinterland was constant, facilitating genetic exchange. The Byzantine influence helps to explain some of the subtle genetic declines seen in the Balkans today. Southeastern populations, such as Bulgarians, Macedonians, and Northern Greeks, who lived in regions more consistently under imperial control, tend to show a slightly stronger genetic affinity with modern Anatolian and Caucasian populations compared to the peoples of the Western Balkans, who were more peripheral to direct Byzantine administration. The empire thus acted as a continuous, centuries-long agent of genetic admixture, preventing the Balkan gene pool from becoming static after the initial Slavic settlement. It maintained and strengthened the peninsula's ancient connections to the Near East, adding further layers of complexity and ensuring that the Balkans remained a genetic crossroads, reflecting the rich and diverse human tapestry of the Eastern Roman world. Concurrent with the early Slavic migrations and the consolidation of Byzantine power, the northern frontiers of the Balkan Peninsula were impacted by the arrival of formidable nomadic confederations from the Eurasian steppe. These groups, primarily of Turkic origin, brought with them a different culture, a different political organization, and a new, albeit limited, genetic element. The first of these major powers were the Avars, who stormed into the Pannonian Basin, modern Hungary, in the mid-6th century, establishing a powerful khaganate that dominated the region for over 250 years. From their heartland, they exerted control over many of the Slavic tribes that were settling in the northwestern Balkans, often using them as auxiliary troops in their raids against the Byzantine Empire. The Avar elite were a heterogeneous group of Central Asian origin, and their graves have revealed East Asian genetic markers, such as Y-DNA haplogroups Q and N. However, the Avars remained a relatively small ruling class, presiding over a much larger subject population of Slavs and remnants of the Romanized Pannonians. Their direct genetic impact on the Balkan gene pool was therefore minimal and largely confined to the elite. When their empire was finally crushed by Charlemagne in the late 8th century, the Avar identity vanished, and their genetic legacy was mostly absorbed into the surrounding Slavic and Magyar populations, leaving only faint traces behind. A far more lasting impact was made by another Turkic-speaking group, the Bulgars. Originating from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, a branch of the Bulgars, led by Khan Asparuh, crossed the Danube River in 680 AD and established a state in the northeastern Balkans, in what is now modern Bulgaria. Here, they encountered a dense population of Slavic settlers, as well as the remnants of the local Thracian and Romanized peoples. Unlike the Avars, the Bulgars succeeded in creating a durable and powerful state, the First Bulgarian Empire, which became a major rival to Byzantium. The Bulgar elite imposed their rule over the more numerous Slavs, forming a symbiotic state. However, over the next 2 centuries, a remarkable process of assimilation occurred. The Turkic Bulgar ruling class gradually adopted the language of their Slavic subjects, converted to Orthodox Christianity, and intermarried with both the Slavic and local nobility. By the 10th century, the original Bulgar language had disappeared, and a new, unified South Slavic identity, Bulgarian, had been forged. Genetically, the contribution of the original Bulgars was that of an elite minority. They introduced Central Asian lineages into the Eastern Balkan gene pool, which, although diluted over centuries of admixture with the Slavic majority, remain a subtle but detectable component that distinguishes modern Bulgarians and their neighbors from other South Slavic groups. This process is a classic example of elite assimilation, where a small, conquering group is ultimately absorbed culturally, linguistically, and genetically by the larger population it rules, yet still leaves a permanent, albeit small, imprint on its genetic makeup. The establishment of these powerful Avar and Bulgar states also had an indirect genetic effect. By creating stable political borders and spheres of influence, they channeled and sometimes restricted gene flow. The Bulgarian Empire, for instance, unified the Slavic tribes and pre-Slavic remnants within its borders, fostering a common identity and a more homogeneous gene pool, distinct from the Slavic groups to the west who would form the Serbian and Croatian peoples. These steppe confederations, therefore, added another thread of ancestry to the northern and eastern Balkans and played a crucial role in the political and demographic processes that led to the formation of the first medieval Balkan states. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and ushered in a new historical epoch for the Balkans, one that would be dominated for nearly 5 centuries by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman conquest brought the entire peninsula, from the gates of Vienna to the southern tip of Greece, under the rule of a single, powerful, non-European state. This long period of Ottoman dominion initiated a new and complex chapter of genetic exchange, introducing novel ancestries and reshaping social structures in ways that had lasting demographic consequences. The Ottoman state was a vast, multi-ethnic empire, and its administration, military, and colonists reflected this diversity. The conquest was accompanied by the settlement of Turkish people from Anatolia, particularly the semi-nomadic Yoriks, who were often settled in strategic locations along major military and trade routes, such as in Thrace, Macedonia, and the plains of Bulgaria. This colonization introduced a significant new genetic component directly from Anatolia. This included Y-DNA haplogroups that were common in Anatolia and the wider Near East, such as specific subclades of J2, JM410, J1, JM267, G2A, GP303, and the Asian branch of R1b, R1b-Z2103, as well as some minor Central Asian lineages tracing back to the original Turkic migrations. Urban centers across the Balkans, such as Sarajevo, Skopje, Thessaloniki, and Monastir, were transformed into bustling Ottoman cities. They became hubs of trade and administration, attracting not only Anatolian Turks but also Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, and merchants from across the empire, creating cosmopolitan environments where gene flow between diverse populations was common. A pivotal aspect of Ottoman society was the role of religion. The conversion of large segments of the native Balkan population to Islam, creating the Bosniak, Pomok, Gorani, and Albanian Muslim communities, had significant genetic implications. While conversion itself is a cultural process, it often led to closer social and marital ties with the Ottoman Turkish administrative class and other Muslim groups within the empire. This facilitated a more intimate and localized gene flow from Anatolian and Near Eastern sources into these specific Balkan communities. Furthermore, the infamous div-Serm system, or child levy, saw Christian boys taken from Balkan villages, converted to Islam, and trained to serve as elite soldiers, janissaries, or administrators. While they were of Balkan origin, their lives within the Ottoman power structure could lead to marriages with women from various parts of the empire, further complicating the genetic picture. The Ottoman social structure, known as the millet system, also played a crucial role. This system organized society along religious lines, granting each community, Orthodox Christian, Armenian, Jewish, etc., a degree of autonomy in its own affairs. A major consequence of this was the reinforcement of religious endogamy, the practice of marrying within one's own community. This tended to preserve the distinct genetic profiles of different groups, even when they lived side by side in the same town or region. A prime example is the arrival of Sephardic Jews, who were expelled from Spain in 1492 and welcomed into the Ottoman Empire, establishing large communities in cities like Thessaloniki and Sarajevo. They maintained their distinct genetic identity for centuries due to religious endogamy. The Ottoman legacy is therefore a complex tapestry. It involved the direct introduction of Anatolian and Near Eastern DNA through colonization, the facilitation of gene flow through conversion and urbanization, and, simultaneously, the preservation of distinct genetic groups through the religiously segregated social structure. This final major layer of influence added yet more diversity to the Balkan gene pool, making it a microcosm of the histories of both southeastern Europe and the Near East. Amidst the grand narratives of migrating peoples and clashing empires, a more subtle but equally profound genetic story was woven into the fabric of the Balkan Peninsula by its pastoralist populations, most notably the Vlachs, also known as Aromanians. The origins of the Vlachs are a subject of historical debate, but the prevailing theory, strongly supported by linguistic and genetic evidence, points to them as the descendants of the Romanized Paleo-Balkan peoples, the Illyrians, Thracians, and Dacians, who adopted a Latin-based language during the centuries of Roman rule. While the arrival of the Slavs in the 6th and 7th centuries led to the assimilation of many of these Romance-speaking communities in the lowlands, others retreated into the highlands, preserving their language and adopting a mobile, pastoralist lifestyle perfectly suited to the rugged mountain terrain. This adaptation was the key to their survival and their unique role as genetic intermediaries. The Vlachs practiced transhumance, a seasonal migration of livestock and people between summer pastures in the high mountains and winter pastures in the lower valleys. This was not a random wandering but a highly organized, annual cycle that followed ancient, well-trodden paths connecting the great mountain ranges of the peninsula. Their routes stretched from the Pindus Mountains in northern Greece, through the Sar Mountains of Macedonia and Albania, up into the Dinaric Alps, and eastwards towards the Balkan and Carpathian Mountains. This constant cyclical movement made the Vlachs a living genetic network, a human thread that stitched together the isolated populations of the Balkan interior. While mountains typically acted as barriers to gene flow, the Vlachs traversed them, carrying their DNA from one valley to the next. A Vlach shepherd from the Pindus might find a wife in a village in the Rhodope Mountains, and their children might later establish a family in the highlands of Serbia. Over centuries, this process acted as a powerful agent of genetic diffusion, preventing the complete isolation of mountain communities and ensuring a degree of shared ancestry across vast and difficult terrain. Their genetic profile is a perfect reflection of their history. The foundational layer is quintessentially Paleo-Balkan, with high frequencies of Y-DNA haplogroups EV13, J2B2, and R1b, lineages that were prominent among the Iron Age peoples of the region. Upon this base is a clear, albeit smaller, italic/Roman signature, a legacy of the colonists and soldiers from whom they adopted their language. Crucially, they also carry significant Slavic admixture, particularly R1a and the Slavic branch of I2a, demonstrating that their retreat to the mountains was not one of absolute isolation but involved continuous interaction and intermarriage with their new Slavic neighbors. This unique blend made them ideal genetic vectors. As they moved, they didn't just carry their own DNA. They picked up genetic markers from one population and deposited them in another. They facilitated a slow, steady gene flow between Greeks, Albanians, and South Slavs, groups that were often separated by linguistic, religious, and political boundaries. In essence, the Vlachs acted as a genetic glue, subtly homogenizing the gene pool of the Balkan highlands and creating connections where geography dictated separation. Their story is a powerful reminder that history is shaped not only by conquering armies and settling farmers, but also by the quiet, persistent movements of pastoralists, whose way of life made them the unassuming custodians of the peninsula's genetic interconnectedness. The extraordinary genetic landscape of the Balkans cannot be understood without appreciating the profound and enduring influence of its topography. More than any single migration or empire, it is the formidable mountain ranges, the Dinaric Alps, the Pindus, the Rhodopes, and the Balkan Mountains, that have sculpted the region's human DNA. These mountains have acted as refugia, sanctuaries that have sheltered human populations not only from the ice sheets of the Pleistocene, but also from the successive waves of migration and conquest that characterized later history. While the fertile river valleys and plains were repeatedly overrun by Neolithic farmers, Indo-European warriors, Roman legions, Slavic tribes, and Ottoman colonists, the remote, high-altitude valleys and plateaus remained largely untouched. This geographic isolation created the perfect laboratory for the powerful evolutionary force of genetic drift. Genetic drift refers to the random fluctuations in the frequency of gene variants, alleles, in a population from one generation to the next. In large, well-mixed populations, its effects are negligible. However, in small, isolated communities, precisely the kind fostered by the Balkan mountainscape, drift can have dramatic consequences. Imagine a small village of a few hundred people, founded in a remote mountain valley. By sheer chance, one of the founding males might carry a slightly rare Y chromosome lineage. Over generations, simply due to random events of who has more sons, this lineage could increase in frequency until it becomes dominant, while other lineages might disappear entirely. This is not natural selection. It is a game of chance played out over centuries, and in isolation, its effects are magnified. This process, repeated in countless valleys across the peninsula, is the primary reason for the astonishing microvariation in the Balkan gene pool. It explains why one village in the highlands of Montenegro might have an exceptionally high concentration of a specific subclade of haplogroup EV13, while a village in the next valley, just 20 kilometers away, might be dominated by a unique branch of J2B2. These communities became genetic islands, preserving and amplifying lineages that might have been rare in the broader ancestral population. This phenomenon also preserved archaic genetic signatures that were diluted or erased in the more accessible lowlands. The Dinaric Alps, in particular, served as the ultimate fortress for the descendants of the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, allowing Y-DNA haplogroup I2A to survive in frequencies seen nowhere else on Earth. While Slavic migrations introduced a new, dominant culture and language to the lowlands, the mountain populations often absorbed this influence more slowly, retaining a much stronger genetic link to the pre-Slavic, Paleo-Balkan inhabitants. The mountains, therefore, acted as vast genetic archives. Each isolated valley system preserved a unique snapshot of the region's deep history, shaped by founder effects and centuries of random drift. This creates a pattern of patchwork genetic diversity, where neighboring populations can be surprisingly distinct from one another. It stands in stark contrast to the genetic landscapes of flatter regions of Europe, like the North European plain, where populations are much more homogeneous over vast distances. The Balkan Mountains ensured that the region's genetic story would not be one of simple layers, but a complex mosaic of ancient lineages, preserved in isolation and sculpted by chance into the unique and fascinating patterns we see today. In direct and dramatic contrast to the isolating role of the mountains, the great river systems of the Balkan Peninsula have acted as dynamic corridors of movement, trade, and genetic exchange throughout human history. These rivers, the mighty Danube and its tributaries the Sava and Morava in the north, and the Vardar, Struma, and Maritsa flowing south into the Aegean, carved natural highways through the rugged landscape, channeling the flow of peoples and ideas and creating zones of intense cultural and genetic admixture. These valleys were the arteries of the peninsula, and their history is a story of constant connection and transformation. The very first farmers to enter Europe from Anatolia traveled along these corridors, with the Vardar-Morava route serving as a primary axis for the spread of the Neolithic Revolution deep into the heart of the continent. For these early agriculturalists, the fertile alluvial plains of the river valleys were prime real estate, allowing their populations to expand rapidly and establish dense networks of villages. Millennia later, these same routes were used by the Indo-European steppe peoples migrating from the north and east, with the Danube Valley acting as a superhighway for their westward expansion. During the Roman era, the engineers who built the empire's famous road network often followed the natural topography of the river valleys. The Via Egnatia, a crucial strategic road connecting the Adriatic to Constantinople, traced the path of the Shkumbin and Devil rivers, while other routes followed the Morava and Vardar. These roads amplified the role of the valleys as conduits for movement, carrying not just legions and administrators but also merchants, colonists, and slaves from every corner of the Roman world, turning the valley towns into cosmopolitan melting pots. The great Slavic migrations of the 6th and 7th centuries were, once again, a river valley phenomenon. The Slavs poured southwards along the Morava and Iskar valleys, overwhelming the existing populations in these accessible and fertile regions. Later still, the Ottoman armies marched north along these same strategic corridors to conquer the peninsula and lay siege to Vienna. The genetic consequences of this history are profound. The populations living within these river corridors have consistently been at the forefront of genetic exchange. They display the highest levels of admixture, carrying genetic signatures from every major migratory wave to have passed through the region. Their DNA is a complex blend of Paleo-Balkan, Anatolian Neolithic, Steppe, Roman-era Mediterranean, Slavic, and Anatolian Turkish ancestries. This creates one of the most striking features of Balkan genetics: the existence of sharp genetic gradients between the lowland corridors and the adjacent highlands. A person from a village in the Morava Valley might be genetically more similar to someone hundreds of kilometers away in the Vardar Valley than to a person from a mountain village just a short distance away. The river valleys represent a world of genetic fusion, while the mountains represent a world of genetic fission. This dynamic interplay between isolating highlands and connecting lowlands is fundamental to the peninsula's uniqueness. It created a checkerboard of genetically distinct populations, preventing the formation of a single homogeneous Balkan gene pool and instead fostering a landscape of incredible diversity, where the story of Europe's great migrations is written into the very DNA of the people who live along its ancient river highways. While geography undeniably laid the foundational blueprint for the Balkan genetic mosaic, it was the powerful influence of human culture, specifically the deeply ingrained practice of endogamy, that drew the fine lines and sharp boundaries within that design. Endogamy, the custom of marrying only within the limits of a local community, clan, tribe, or religious group, has been a pervasive force throughout Balkan history, acting as a social barrier to gene flow that was often as impassable as a mountain range. This practice served to preserve distinct identities and, consequently, distinct genetic profiles, creating a fine-grained tapestry of human variation. In the rugged highlands of the Western Balkans, particularly in regions like northern Albania, Montenegro, and the Moni Peninsula of southern Greece, society was historically organized around kinship-based structures such as clans and tribes. These groups, like the Kusi or Piperi tribes of Montenegro, functioned as semi-independent social and political units. Loyalty to the clan was paramount, and marriage was a critical tool for forging alliances and maintaining the group's integrity. While some degree of marriage between allied clans, exogamy, occurred, there was a strong preference for marrying within the larger tribal confederation, and often within the clan itself. Over centuries, this tribal endogamy had a powerful genetic effect. It ensured that the paternal lineages, Y-DNA, of the clan's founders were passed down with minimal introduction of outside DNA, leading to an extraordinary concentration of specific haplogroups. This is why genetic studies can sometimes link a particular Y-DNA subclade to a specific historical clan, providing a direct window into the region's social history. The arrival of the Ottoman Empire introduced a new and even more powerful form of endogamy based on religion. The Ottoman millet system, which organized society into autonomous religious communities, formalized and reinforced the separation between different faiths. For nearly 500 years, Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Muslims, and Jews lived as distinct, self-governing populations. Interreligious marriage was rare and socially prohibited. This had a profound impact on the peninsula's gene pool. It meant that the descendants of the medieval Christian populations, Serbs, Greeks, Bulgarians, largely stopped mixing with the descendants of those who converted to Islam, Bosniaks, Albanian Muslims, or with the incoming Turkish colonists. This religious segregation acted as a powerful genetic firewall. It preserved the pre-Ottoman genetic signatures of the Christian populations and, simultaneously, allowed the Muslim communities to develop their own distinct profiles through a combination of their native Balkan ancestry and admixture with Anatolian Turks and other Muslims from across the empire. The Sephardic Jewish communities, welcomed into the empire after their expulsion from Spain, provide another stark example. Living for centuries in cities like Thessaloniki and Sarajevo, they maintain their unique genetic heritage, a blend of Middle Eastern and Iberian ancestry, almost entirely through strict religious endogamy. This interplay of tribal, religious, and simple geographic endogamy, where people in isolated villages had no choice but to marry neighbors, created sharp genetic boundaries that often defy geography, with neighboring villages of different faiths or tribal affiliations showing markedly different genetic profiles. It is this cultural layer of self-imposed isolation, laid atop the physical isolation of the landscape, that is truly key to the intricate and finely patterned genetic diversity of the Balkan peoples. While the Balkan interior was being shaped by highland isolation and lowland migrations, its long and intricate coastline was part of a different world, the interconnected maritime civilization of the Mediterranean. From the Bronze Age to the early modern period, the Adriatic, Ionian, and Aegean seas were not barriers but highways, carrying a constant traffic of traders, colonists, pirates, and sailors who wove the Balkan coast into a wider web of genetic exchange. This maritime activity created a distinct coastal genetic profile, one that was more cosmopolitan and pan-Mediterranean than that of the immediate hinterland. The tradition of seafaring in the region is ancient. In the Iron Age, Illyrian tribes like the Liburnians were renowned for their swift ships and maritime prowess, engaging in both trade and piracy across the Adriatic. Their activities brought them into contact with Greek and Italic peoples, initiating a pattern of coastal gene flow. This was dramatically amplified by the wave of Greek colonization starting in the 8th century BC, which established cities like Epidamnos and Apollonia, planting Aegean DNA directly onto the eastern Adriatic shore. However, the most significant and sustained maritime influence came from the Italian peninsula, first with Rome and later, and more profoundly, with the maritime republics of Venice and Ragusa, Dubrovnik. For centuries, the Venetian Republic was the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean, and its empire was a string of coastal forts, islands, and port cities. From Istria and Dalmatia down to Crete and Cyprus, Venetian rule established a common political and economic sphere. Cities like Zadar, Zara, Split, Spalotto, Kotera, Kat-Taro, and Corfu became vital links in this network. This was not a mass migration of Venetians, but a steady settlement of administrators, soldiers, merchants, and artisans who formed the ruling and commercial elite. These men often took local wives, resulting in a continuous, sex-biased gene flow from the Italian peninsula into the coastal Balkan population. The Republic of Ragusa, a powerful Slavic-speaking maritime state, played a similar role, connecting the Balkan hinterland to the trade routes of the Mediterranean. The genetic legacy of this long era of maritime interaction is clearly visible today. Coastal populations in Croatia, Montenegro, and Albania show a higher frequency of Y-DNA haplogroups that are common in Italy and the Aegean, such as certain subclades of J2A, EV13, and R1b, particularly R1b, U152, the archetypal Italic lineage, than their inland counterparts. This creates a distinct genetic gradient as one moves from the coast to the interior. The DNA of a person from a Dalmatian coastal town might show a significant component of Italian ancestry, linking them to the history of Venice, while the DNA of someone from the Dinaric Highlands just 50 kilometers away would reflect a much deeper Paleobalkan and Slavic heritage. This maritime connection also brought more distant influences. Trade with the Levant and North Africa, though less intensive, still contributed to the genetic diversity of the port cities. The sea, therefore, created a unique genetic environment along the Balkan littoral. It fostered a population that was ethnically and linguistically diverse, facing outwards towards the wider Mediterranean world, and whose DNA tells a story of trade, empire, and the constant movement of people across the wine-dark sea. As the power of the Ottoman Empire began to recede from the 17th century onwards, a new imperial force, the Habsburg monarchy of Austria, expanded southwards, eventually incorporating the northern swaths of the Balkan Peninsula into its domain. This shift in power from an Eastern, Anatolian-based empire to a Central European one initiated the final major chapter of genetic layering in the region's history. The integration of Slovenia, Croatia, and the Vojvodina region of modern Serbia into what would become the Austro-Hungarian Empire created a new frontier and facilitated a significant, state-sponsored movement of people from Central and Eastern Europe into the Northern Balkans. This process fundamentally altered the genetic landscape of these areas, pulling them into the orbit of Central Europe and creating a distinct north-south genetic gradient across the peninsula. A cornerstone of Habsburg policy was the creation and maintenance of the military frontier, Vojna Krajina, a vast defensive buffer zone that stretched along the border with the Ottoman Empire. This territory, carved out of parts of modern Croatia and Serbia, was directly administered from Vienna and was systematically settled with populations who were granted land in exchange for military service. The settlers were deliberately chosen for their martial traditions and loyalty to the emperor, and they were drawn from across the Habsburg lands and beyond. While a large number were Orthodox Serbs fleeing Ottoman rule, a migration that significantly shaped the ethnic map of the region, the Habsburgs also settled thousands of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, and Rusins, Ukrainians, in the fertile plains of Slavonia and Vojvodina. This policy transformed the Pannonian Basin portion of the Balkans into one of the most ethnically and religiously diverse regions in all of Europe. The genetic consequences were immediate and lasting. This large-scale organized migration introduced a substantial new layer of Central and Eastern European DNA into the Northern Balkan gene pool. This included Y-DNA haplogroups that are common among these groups, Germanic lineages like I1 and specific subclades of R1b, R1b, U106, West Slavic branches of R1a, R1a, M458, and Hungarian/Uralic markers like N1c. This influx did not replace the existing South Slavic genetic substrate but mixed with it, creating a new and complex synthesis. Today, the genetic profiles of people from northern Croatia and northern Serbia clearly reflect this history. They show a closer genetic affinity to their northern neighbors, Hungarians, Austrians, and Czechs, than to their fellow South Slavs in Bosnia, Montenegro, or Bulgaria. This Austro-Hungarian layer is what genetically distinguishes the Pannonian South Slavs from the Dinaric and Balkan Mountain South Slavs. The former are a product of the meeting point between the Balkans and Central Europe, while the latter were shaped more by the legacy of the Paleo-Balkan peoples, Byzantium, and the Ottomans. This period highlights how political shifts can directly engineer demographic and genetic change, demonstrating that the final brushstrokes on the complex canvas of Balkan DNA were painted not by ancient migrations, but by the imperial policies of the early modern era. In the turbulent centuries that marked the decline of the Western Roman Empire, the Balkan Peninsula served as a chaotic stage for the dramatic movements of various peoples who breached the Danube frontier. This era, often termed the migration period, is popularly associated with the barbarian invasions, and two names loom large in its history: the Huns and the Goths. While their military and political impact was immense, their genetic legacy in the Balkans is a more subtle and contentious question, illustrating the important distinction between a transient military conquest and a lasting demographic settlement. The Huns, a nomadic confederation of Central Asian origin, exploded into Europe in the late 4th century AD, creating a vast, short-lived empire under their famous leader, Attila. Their heartland was in the Pannonian Basin, from where they launched devastating raids deep into the Roman Balkans, sacking cities and extracting enormous tributes. Genetically, the Hunnic elite would have carried East Eurasian lineages, such as Y-DNA haplogroups Q and N. However, the Huns were a military aristocracy ruling over a much larger and more diverse subject population of Goths, Alans, and other Germanic and Sarmatian peoples. Their numbers were relatively small, and their empire disintegrated rapidly after Attila's death in 453. Consequently, their direct genetic contribution to the modern Balkan gene pool is considered to be negligible, likely amounting to a few scattered lineages that were quickly absorbed into the larger populations. Their primary impact was indirect. The terror they inspired acted as a catalyst, pushing other groups, most notably the Goths, into Roman territory. The Goths, a Germanic people, had already settled north of the Danube before the Huns arrived. Fleeing the Hunnic advance, large groups of Visigoths crossed into the Balkans in 376, famously defeating a Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople. For decades, they moved through the peninsula, alternately serving as Roman federates and raiding the provinces, before eventually moving on to sack Rome and establish a kingdom in Iberia. They were followed by the Ostrogoths, who, under Theodoric the Great, consolidated power in the Balkans before invading Italy to establish their own kingdom. The Goths would have carried characteristic Germanic paternal lineages, primarily Y-DNA haplogroup I1 and specific subclades of R1b, like R1b U106. It is almost certain that some of these lineages were introduced into the Balkan population during their decades-long presence. However, like the Huns, the Goths were primarily a mobile military class, not a mass of settling farmers. Their numbers were small compared to the resident Romano-Balkan population, and their ultimate focus lay elsewhere, in Italy and Spain. Therefore, their genetic footprint was likely very light and has been largely overprinted by the subsequent, far more massive migration of the Slavs. Distinguishing the faint Gothic genetic signal from later German settlements during the Austro-Hungarian era is also extremely difficult. The story of the Huns and Goths in the Balkans is thus a crucial historical lesson. Not all major historical actors leave a significant genetic trace. Their legacy serves as a reminder that cultural and political impact can be immense even when the demographic and genetic impact is fleeting. And it highlights why the large-scale settlement of the Slavs a century later would prove to be a far more transformative event for the DNA of the peninsula. To comprehend the foundational genetic identity of the Balkan Peninsula, one must trace the remarkable journey of a single paternal lineage, Y-DNA haplogroup I2A. More than any other genetic marker, its story is inextricably linked with the region's deep history, from the Ice Age hunters to the medieval Slavic states. It is the quintessential Old European lineage, and its unique distribution and complex history are central to why Balkan DNA is so distinct. The origins of haplogroup I, the parent of I2A, lie with the first anatomically modern humans to colonize Europe, the Cro-Magnons. It is the only major Y-DNA haplogroup to have originated within the continent, a direct genetic link to the Paleolithic peoples who painted the caves of Lascaux and Altamira. During the last glacial maximum, as ice sheets forced human populations into southern refugia, the Balkan Peninsula became the primary sanctuary for the branch that would become I2A. For over 10,000 years, these hunter-gatherer populations lived and diversified in the sheltered valleys and coastlines of the Balkans, making this haplogroup the region's aboriginal paternal lineage. As the ice retreated, populations carrying I2A expanded outwards from this Balkan homeland, repopulating parts of Central and Western Europe. However, its highest frequency and diversity remained in its ancestral cradle. The arrival of Neolithic farmers and later the Indo-Europeans introduced new lineages that became dominant in many parts of Europe. But in the rugged Western Balkans, I2A held on, forming a resilient genetic bedrock. Today, the subclade I2A1b, M423, is found in astonishingly high frequencies in the Dinaric Alps, reaching its global peak among the populations of Bosnia and Herzegovina, over 50%, Croatia, Serbia, and Montenegro. This distribution aligns almost perfectly with the territory of the ancient Illyrians, suggesting it was the dominant lineage among these Iron Age tribes. However, the story has a dramatic twist. Another major subclade, I2A1A2B, L621, tells a tale of migration and return. It is believed that a branch of the original Balkan I2A population migrated northwards into Eastern Europe in the post-glacial period. There, in the forested lands north of the Carpathian Mountains, this lineage became caught up in the ethnogenesis of the Slavic peoples. It experienced a massive population expansion and became one of the primary paternal markers of the early Slavs, alongside R1A. Consequently, when the Slavs began their great migration south into the Balkans in the 6th century, they brought this northern branch of I2A back with them in huge numbers. This creates a fascinating genetic paradox. The single most characteristic native Balkan haplogroup is also one of the primary markers of the incoming Slavic settlers. This dual history is the key to understanding its modern distribution. The extremely high frequencies in the Dinaric West represent the original pre-Slavic Paleo-Balkan population that resisted assimilation, while its significant presence among Bulgarians and other Eastern South Slavs is largely a product of the Slavic migration. The journey of I2A encapsulates the entire narrative of Balkan genetics, a story of ancient continuity in a glacial refugium, of persistence against waves of newcomers, and of a dramatic large-scale return that reshaped the very region from which it originated. It is the genetic thread that binds the peninsula's oldest inhabitants to its modern Slavic-speaking populations. While the study of the Y chromosome reveals a dramatic and often turbulent story of Balkan history written in paternal lines, a narrative dominated by migration, conquest, and elite dominance, the analysis of mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, tells a different, more subtle, and arguably more ancient tale. Passed down exclusively from mother to child, mtDNA traces the matrilineal history of a population, providing a crucial counterbalance to the male-centric picture. The story told by the maternal lineages of the Balkans is one of deep, abiding continuity, resilience, and the quiet absorption of newcomers, suggesting that while the men who ruled the peninsula may have changed frequently, the women often provided a stable, deep-rooted foundation. When examining the broad landscape of Balkan mtDNA, the first observation is that it is quintessentially European. The major haplogroups present, H, U, J, T, and K, are the same ones found across the continent, from Ireland to the Urals. Haplogroup H is the most common, accounting for over 40% of lineages, just as it does in most of Europe. This immediately suggests that the major demographic events in the Balkans were not wholesale population replacements that affected both sexes equally. Instead, they were often male-driven processes. Incoming groups of Neolithic farmers, Indo-European warriors, or Slavic tribes were frequently composed of more men than women. These men, upon settling in the Balkans, would have taken wives from the local, indigenous populations. This pattern, known as sex-biased admixture, leaves a distinct genetic signature. The Y chromosome pool changes dramatically, while the mtDNA pool changes much less, absorbing the new arrivals. Beneath the broad European canvas, however, lie details that reinforce the theme of ancient continuity. Haplogroup U, particularly its subclades U5 and U4, is strongly associated with the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Europe. Its significant presence in the Balkans is the maternal counterpart to the paternal I2A lineage, a genetic echo of the women who lived in the Balkan glacial refugium tens of thousands of years ago. Similarly, haplogroups J and T, while widespread, are thought to have been major lineages among the first Neolithic farmers who spread from Anatolia. Their frequency in the Balkans traces the path of the first farming women who brought agriculture to Europe. Unlike the Y-DNA, which shows sharp geographic boundaries corresponding to historical events, like the Slavic versus pre-Slavic divide, the distribution of mtDNA haplogroups is much more diffuse and clinal. The genetic differences between Balkan women from different regions are less pronounced than the differences between the men. This suggests a more interconnected female history, perhaps facilitated by patrilocal marriage patterns, where women would move to their husband's village, creating a web of maternal connections across different paternal clans or tribes. The overall picture provided by mtDNA is one of a deep and stable maternal gene pool established in the Mesolithic and Neolithic periods. This ancient foundation was so large and resilient that it was able to absorb the maternal lineages of subsequent, smaller-scale arrivals, be they Romans, Slavs, or Turks, without being fundamentally altered. The story of Balkan DNA is therefore a dual narrative, a dynamic and often replaced paternal landscape laid over a deeply rooted and remarkably constant maternal bedrock. The unique genetic identity of the Balkan Peninsula is not the result of a single, defining event or an exclusive ancestral group, but rather the cumulative product of its entire, multi-layered history. It is a palimpsest, a manuscript on which successive waves of humanity have written their genetic signature, with no previous layer ever being fully erased. Modern genetic studies, which analyze the entire genome, autosomal DNA, allow us to deconstruct this palimpsest and quantify the various ancestral streams that have converged to create the present-day populations. The resulting picture is one of extraordinary complexity, confirming the peninsula's dual role as both a long-term sanctuary and a perpetual crossroads of Europe and Asia. The synthesis begins with the deepest layer, the Paleolithic foundation, derived from the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who survived the Ice Age in the Balkan refugium. This ancestry, genetically represented by Y-DNA I2A and mtDNA U, is the oldest European component and is most concentrated in the Western Balkans, particularly in the Dinaric Alps, providing a direct link to the continent's first inhabitants. Upon this foundation was laid the Neolithic influx, a substantial wave of ancestry from Anatolian farmers who arrived around 8,500 years ago. They brought agriculture and new lineages like Y-DNA EV13, G2A, and J2, transforming the region's culture and gene pool, especially in the fertile lowlands of the south and east. The next major layer was the Bronze Age steppe migration, which introduced Indo-European languages and a new genetic component from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, marked by Y-DNA R1A and R1B. This ancestry is a fundamental component of all Balkan populations, but is generally stronger in the north and east. These three ancient streams, Mesolithic hunter-gatherer, Anatolian farmer, and steppe pastoralist, form the foundational triad of Balkan, and indeed European, genetics. What makes the Balkans unique is the specific proportions of this blend, with a notably higher retention of the hunter-gatherer component compared to much of Europe. Subsequent history added further complexity. The classical and imperial admixture during the Greek, Roman, and Byzantine periods facilitated a continuous low-level gene flow from across the Mediterranean, enriching the coastal and urban populations. The most transformative later event was the Slavic migration, which introduced a massive new wave of Eastern European ancestry, primarily marked by Y-DNA R1A and the Slavic branch of I2A. This created a new linguistic and genetic landscape, but one which was fundamentally a blend, as the newcomers mixed with and absorbed the substantial pre-existing Romano-Balkan population. Finally, the medieval and modern inputs from the Ottoman era brought Anatolian and Near Eastern DNA, while the Austro-Hungarian period introduced a Central European layer in the north. The uniqueness of Balkan DNA, therefore, lies in this intricate layering, combined with the powerful effects of local geography and culture. The mountains created pockets of ancient continuity and genetic drift, while the rivers served as corridors for admixture. Social practices like tribal and religious endogamy erected invisible barriers to gene flow, creating a fine-scale mosaic of genetically distinct communities. The result is one of the most complex, historically informative, and fascinating genetic landscapes on Earth, a living testament to the enduring legacy of the countless peoples who have called this remarkable peninsula home. This narrative explored how geography, migration, and culture made Balkan DNA a unique historical map. From ancient survivors to modern nations, each chapter added a new layer. What did you find most interesting? Your feedback and suggestions for improvement are welcome in the comments below.